Welcome back to the Ignatius Press podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Petiprin, and today we are discussing one of the great saints of our era, and that is Saint Thérèse of Lisieux. My guest today is Father Tom Hiney, who is in England, and he has written a great book for Ignatius Press in recent times called The Song of Ascents, Lives of Rage and Stillness. He's also written for other publications, including The Spectator, The Observer. He's written a biography of Raymond Chandler, and he came into full communion with the Catholic Church from the Church of England in 2020. We're talking to him today because he is working now on a book about Thérèse of Lisieux for Ignatius Press, which we think will be due out next year. Now, before I welcome in Father Tom Hiney, I'd also like to tell you about some things that are available right now from Ignatius Press about Saint Thérèse of Lisieux. One of them is a book called Saint Thérèse of Lisieux, Living on Love by Father Didier Marie Golay. This is a wonderful book that is not only informative about Saint Thérèse's life, but is full of really beautiful pictures and charts and things to look at that I think could really give everybody a good sense of Thérèse and her times. Another great book that we offer at Ignatius Press is called Saint Thérèse of Lisieux, Story of a Life by Guy Gaucher, which is a more conventional biography, a really excellent book that we encourage everybody to check out. Lastly, Ignatius also sells a movie, a feature film about Saint Thérèse of Lisieux, which is called Miracle of Saint Therese. You can find all of these things at ignatius.com, and I would encourage you to do so. But now for our conversation about Therese with our guest, Father Tom Hiney. Father, welcome to the Ignatius Press podcast.
Thanks, Andrew. It's good to be here.
Well, it's great to have the opportunity to talk to you today because, as I said, you're working on a book about Saint Thérèse of Lisieux, and the occasion for our conversation really is that we find ourselves here in the year 2025, 100 years after the canonization of Saint Thérèse of Lisieux. This is a great milestone. It's a great opportunity for us to revisit her life and her times. So I thought we could start with this. Probably a lot of our audience knows something about Saint Thérèse of Lisieux. She's a popular saint, but 100 years after her canonization, I thought maybe we could start with this question. Why today is she just as important or maybe even more important than she's ever been for us as Catholics living in the world today?
Sure. Well, I think, look, there's been milestones with Therese where these kind of conversations have happened, like sort of looking back on 50 years, on 75 years and so on. And even at the centenary of her death in 1997, they reckoned 900 books had been written about Therese. And on one level, you have to think like, how can you sort of say anything new? How can there be anything fresh to learn about someone who died at 24, who's had such exposure? And that could apply just simply to a devotion. I mean, you can love her, but how much more can you say? And yet it's the nature of her, because of the way that she was, because of her transparency with the Lord, because of her docility before the Lord, that there's a divinity going on within her. Like John of the Cross said as John Paul II himself, drawing out John of the Cross's spirituality in his doctoral thesis, said faith itself has something of the divine. And when you see faith operating in Therese's life, and because of her ability to communicate that, because of her ability as a letter writer and as a sort of an autobiographer, we are looking at the relationship between a soul and God, and that is endlessly edifying. And I mean, Pope St. John Paul II said when he proclaimed her a doctor, described her as having a profound understanding of the spiritual life through experience, and that it was so vast and profound that he was declaring her a doctor.
Father Hiney, in your research and your work on Saint Therese, what are maybe one or two things or something that your typical admirer of Saint Therese, let alone people who have never heard of her, what maybe don't we know about her or don't appreciate enough about her?
I think we tend to mold saints to our own purposes sometimes. I mean, that can come from going to shrines and just asking for very sort of personal favors rather than for sanctification, which is probably what most saints would much rather us ask for. I think with Therese, her sincerity, her integrity, and her docility, these are great attributes in an age that we're facing, where a lot of things feel superficial, and I mean, we live in a world where I think fake news is quite internalized. We have our own fake news. We talk to ourselves rubbish, and she's shining through brightly. I can't say that I'm producing any sort of fresh evidence biographically, but for me, she continues to shine brightly into each age because she is the consummate, transparent Christian. And yeah, and her theology of suffering, I think, is very profound. I think we shy away from this, um, and yet she shows us that what the saints Teresa of Avila and through to Teresa of Calcutta were always sort of like emphasizing that sorrow and joy are not incompatible. And in our language, we need to break away from those happy face, sad face, kind of like sort of, sort of differences. Like, we are both. How can we not be brokenhearted in a world like this? And yet, how can we not be joyful having the God that we do? We are called to be permanently both. And I was with a Catholic artist at the weekend, and he was saying, you see that in so many of the medieval paintings of the saints and of Our Lady. That's why you don't sometimes know, is she smiling or not? It's because she's doing both. And Therese was doing both, and she lived very close to our own age. So we have photographs of her. We have this very, very fresh writing, she's a very good writer. And so she can communicate as much as she goes as far as she can in allowing us to get inside her mind and feel what it would be like to be holy. Yeah, I can't say enough about her. I think she just merits more and more sort of closer examination.
Yeah. And, something that maybe isn't appreciated enough, I think, is that when we think about a figure like Therese, who died before World War I and was, canonized shortly thereafter, we're already thinking of that time as quite far away, or maybe anyway, in my country, in the United States, we tend to, anything, even if it's a black and white photograph, right? I mean, we have a photograph of this saint, and yet it's black and white, it's grainy, it seems like a kind of a different era. But in many respects, Therese was living in this era, which was still in this sort of long wake of the French Revolution and of the Industrial Revolution. All this stuff is changing in her lifetime. We're still very much dealing with some of those effects as well. So I wonder if maybe you could situate for us a little bit Therese and her times. What was unique about the world that she was sort of brought up in that created in her the conditions for becoming this great saint?
That's a good question. I mean, the French Revolution had a viciously anti-clerical side to it. Religious priests were literally killed. It wasn't just nasty columnists or kind of like lawsuits. They were butchered, and there was violence to an extent on both sides. I mean, there were elements within the church, or at least elements within conservative French society that got angry. I mean, they were in the original culture wars. That phrase "Kulturkampf" originated from the similar process that was going on in Germany between the Catholic Church and the system there, and it applied to France. And she lived in the wake of that, and in the wake of the challenges of the revolution, many French Catholics had simply drifted away from the church. It wasn't a simple case of you're either with us or you're against us. For many who'd been going to mass as cultural Catholics, they realized, oh, we don't have to. And look, there are poets and artists ridiculing the priests, and suddenly the bubble was popped to an extent. And so Therese could grow up with her father, who was a devout shop owner, being one of the few of his friends who didn't open up his shop on a Sunday. And this is in the 1870s. So all of the stuff that we're dealing with is emerging there. And you see that in the French writers of the time, people like Garanger, they're anticipating exactly what we're dealing with. In fact, they're seeing it coming. And so they're already trying to respond to it. And finally, I would actually say that the French Revolution, in as much as it was the Enlightenment kind of crystallized to an extent, it was asking difficult questions. There's no ways about it. We have to answer those questions. And Therese did.
Yeah, let's say more about that, Father, because I mean, she answered, or she wrestled with those questions by becoming a nun. I mean, what an interesting way to do that. Like, how do you like talk about that with people? Like, what is that a good option even for us now to become a nun or to consecrate our lives in some particular way as a way of responding to the problems that we must face in the world today?
I think what she was able to do, and I think it's really important that we do this right now, is that she could disentangle the challenges of secularism with the reality of some aspects of people within the church. So she wasn't defending the banality and the mediocrity and the worldliness that did operate within the church. She could see some church figures, and one's always careful that the church is the mystical body of Christ. The church, in that sense, is beyond reproach. But she knew, and in fact, it broke her heart that there were priests who fell short of that, and there were hierarchy who were exploiting the centuries of political power that the church had had in France, and who weren't necessarily particularly holy people. And so she gave her response a bit like Ignatius of Loyola, who experienced the same sort of realization on his conversion. Instead of walking away from the church, she and him and Therese of Avila and all the renewal Catholics really dedicated themselves to being the real deal. Because when just even one person decides to take Jesus seriously, it's radical. It changes the world. It's so profound. I mean, Edith Stein said on her conversion that there were perhaps like just hardly any actual Christians. If there were, the world would stop in its tracks. She had the guts to attempt to be a real Christian.
Yeah, I think that's very insightful. And, I mean, what an interesting background that she had. I mean, we'll get to this a little more later, but her parents are also canonized saints. So, I mean, what a fascinating thing for us to examine this life that, she grew up with saints. And yet she herself had this profound personal encounter, it appears, where she describes having had this sort of complete conversion, where she herself seemed to have received this incredible outpouring of grace for this vocation that she entered. I have to wonder about that just a little bit as a kind of both as a kind of timeless thing like St. Paul's conversion, and then also as quite a modern thing where we look out on the world and its brokenness in this very particular modern way, and we invite God to use us as some kind of vessel for transformation. Is that kind of what you're getting at when you're talking about, Therese's, the trajectory of her life?
I mean, on the conversion front, conversion when it's Cardinal Cantalamessa said that we're called to a series of conversions, all of us, in the course of our life. that's the kind of conversion that's how we can locate Therese's conversion on Christmas night. That, you know, in her early teens, she had a moment where she was a pampered youngest child, and there was a little family custom to do with how the presents were set up on Christmas Eve, and it was really a childhood sort of custom. And she overheard her father saying, "Hopefully, this is the last year we have to do with this with Therese." In her natural state, she could have had a very serious tantrum. She was still a very profound and pious girl, but there was that strain within her that probably, you know, went back to her mother's death. In any case, she needed sanctification like we all do. And at that moment, and we can all we all know what that's like. She had a choice. She was either going to like just go into that tantrum, or she was going to pull back. And the grace of Christmas Eve, she said, allowed her to step back from it and just not to go there. And she went back downstairs and played the part beautifully. And she says it changed her life. And that's one of, you know, it wasn't a mountaintop experience. She wasn't on the road to Damascus, but we all know exactly what those moments are like. And for her to give it that kind of value actually helps us to know that even right now, this afternoon, there could be something that I don't do, which I'm tempted to do, which could change my life. That's where her applicability starts to sort of show itself. Yeah.
That's beautifully put. I think wonderful way to sum up that experience that she had. Before we move on to talk about the story of a soul for a moment, would you just remind our listeners and viewers of the famous story of her meeting with Pope Leo XIII? Because I just think that's one of the most interesting parts of her biography.
Yeah, so she joined, she and her father and her sister Celine joined a pilgrimage from the diocese of Bayeux, and they went down by train. It was quite a significant historical pilgrimage because of all the upheavals that'd been in with the revolutions across Europe. And so it was a sort of profound statement. A lot of significant French Catholics coming down on this pilgrimage. And they were received and given an audience by Pope Leo. It actually happened in this tower. I was shown actually by a sister who works at the Vatican a few months ago. It's in the gardens. It's a tower. It's close to where Benedict XVI lived towards the end of his life. And he received them there. And she had been told, together with all the rest, just go and, greet him and then move on. You can't say anything to him. We haven't got time. She had this pressing question, which was that, please, will you allow me to go into the Carmel at the age of 14, which is what she was. The French church wanted sisters not to enter such a rigorous life until they're 21, partly because they didn't want the criticism of the secular authorities who were starting to encroach on their schooling rights, and all sorts of stuff was going on. Therese asked him, and he looked at her, and they had a moment, and he said to her, if it's God's will, it'll happen. She said, but if you say it, it'll happen too. At which point she was dragged off by a Swiss guard. And a nice detail is that Swiss guard remembered the moment, and his daughter ended up becoming a nun, somehow touched by the moment. And in any case, it was God's will, and she entered the following year, aged 15.
Wow. That is just such a dramatic little story that I think says a lot about her and maybe about Leo XIII as well, who's a pope I admire very much. Let's talk about the story of a soul. So we're now talking about Therese, the nun. She's allowed to enter the Carmel, and she writes the story of a soul. But how did that come to happen? What is the story of a soul for those who aren't that familiar with it?
Sure. So she is asked, her health is starting to fail a few years after she's entered, and she is 2.5 years short of actually dying. And her blood sisters, who are also in the Carmel, ask her to write down some family memoirs. Therese had inherited her father's skill as a raconteur. She was a mimic. She could remember details. Way back, almost preternaturally to an incredible young age, she could remember these extraordinary details and tell them really well. They loved hearing her talk, and she would entertain the other sisters with memories of her parents and her upbringing. And so they asked her to write them down. And so she wrote this memoir, and initially thinking that it was purely going to be for a family audience, because who else would want to read these quirky little details? By the time she finished it, her health was quite sort of significantly advanced or her loss of health. And it sat with her elder sister Pauline, who by that point was prioress. And it was only later, when it was clear that Therese was dying, that she wrote another long piece at the request of her sister Marie, on Marie simply asking, could she write something about what it was like to sort of see reality from her perspective? Therese was on retreat. Marie was aware, as were her sisters, that something very, very special was going on in Therese, that she wasn't just a nice sister, that it was very profound and mystical what was happening. So Marie asked for her to try and describe the landscape of her soul. She wrote this beautiful piece, and then right at the end, literally months before she died, the prioress asked her to write a final section on love, a meditation on love. Those three things were put together after her death, given the title that Therese herself hadn't chosen, but she was aware before she died that it would be published. She had a sense that it would reach a global audience. She knew that was going to happen. But that was put together as a story of a soul. That's what we have now.
And this is where she articulates the idea of the little way, right?
Yeah, so the little way is, the little way can be a little bit of a dangerous category, I think, when it comes to Therese. It's there throughout her writing, this emphasis on humility, this emphasis on what she calls hiddenness. But one has to make sure that one always sees it in combination with the vigor and the ambition of Therese. That incident with Leo XIII has got both. She's on her knees. She is obedient, but she has the guts to sort of say to the Holy Father, "Come on, like if you say it, it'll happen." And that is with her in this so-called little way. She realizes that docility is power, that God exists, and that he is looking to draw us to himself in Jesus Christ. And Therese realized that to embark on the fullness of union with God, one had to ultimately receive more than one ever did. And yet, rather than that being an excuse for quietism or for some sort of false humility, she offered herself as an oblation, as she put it, to God and to the love of God. And so in reducing herself to this creature that she understood that she was, she actually elevated herself to an experience of God that was so profound that John Paul II identified that as the reason a significant reason why he was proclaiming her as a doctor. It was because alongside the systematic theologians in the history of the church, there was also a place for those who, through experience and docility, had knowledge and an understanding of the workings of God. And that, he said, Therese had. So I think her little way, it was about taking opportunities in the day to be kind, because sometimes those are massive spiritual victories. But it was also in one's relationship with God, accepting that one was a creature and that he was creator, then accepting that he genuinely loved you and allowing that love to happen. Yeah.
Yeah, and it seems like what you're saying, Father, is that she had a strong understanding of her own worth and dignity. She was not trying to sort of diminish herself, but rather to sort of understand herself as worthy because she was a creature of God. Um, and I found it interesting because I suppose I had never heard it before, that she did actually intend for her story of a soul to be widely read and appreciated.
By the end. So the first section, I think we can safely say, is written with no idea that that would happen. By the last two sections, and particularly the last section, she had intuited, she had prayerfully understood that she had anticipated, however one wants to put it, that this was going to happen. And this is included if you read the last conversations, which are the things that she said on her deathbed, which were gathered by her sisters, which is published as a standalone book these days. Mentioned there is this realization, particularly as she talks to her sister Pauline, because she identified Pauline as her editor, or mon historien. Therese was interestingly a little bit dyslexic. Her spelling was really bad, and she'd written a lot of it in very short periods that she actually had to write. Hadn't reread it, hadn't proofed it. And so she knew it needed tidying up. And because she realized the audience it was going to receive, she left very clear instructions to her sister to act on her behalf with regards to preparing the text.
And obviously the text began to be appreciated very quickly, and her renown grew very quickly because she was canonized very shortly after her death. What were the circumstances of that, of Pius XI really, really seeing in her the qualities of being a saint and canonizing her?
Well, I mean, it was very quick. It was. Yeah, she dies in 1897. She's beatified in 1923, canonized in 1925. Pius X had already proclaimed her the greatest saint of modern times before her canonization. So the magisterium was on board, and it was effectively a dispensation was granted to her cause, because there was normally a longer delay. I mean, it's hard to go back into those times and to sort of to answer your question from the perspective of Pius XI. But clearly, there was the faith of the people was certainly behind it. I mean, 500,000 people crowded into St. Peter's Square for the canonization. The number of miracles that have been reported was so large. I mean, you'll know that a certain small number are needed for these causes. There were so many coming in from Therese that there was actually a magazine being published, like out of the Carmel in Lisieux, with all of the accounts. I mean, thousands and thousands of miracles. Somewhere along the line between the writings and the miracles, it just gained a momentum of its own, and that's continued. The bubble hasn't burst. I mean, when her relics toured Ireland in 2001, and you know how much of a struggle the church has had in Ireland and that struggle was already starting back then. A business newspaper in Dublin reported that 3/4 of the Irish population had gone out to see the relics. It was the biggest public event in Irish history. And asked by a journalist why this was happening, one of the organizers said, and I think this is very beautiful, people recognize holiness when they see it and they want to be near it. And so that side of Therese, just the popularity of her certainly has pushed things forward, but there's been a very sort of profound appreciation of her writings. Even as recently as Telexit Nos, Pope Francis dedicated 5 or 6 paragraphs to Therese. Therese and Newman were the two sort of like big saints of that encyclical.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful comparison, by the way. I mean, maybe a topic for another conversation, but I mean, she and Newman were basically contemporaries or overlapped anyway, and are very important saints, I think, together for our times. I know a lot of people go, for example, to Birmingham to see, Newman's oratory and things like that, and a lot of people go to Lisieux, don't they? I mean, it's become a major pilgrimage site, from what I understand.
Yeah, I'm headed there myself for the for the feast, which will be the 100th feast since her canonization in a few days, and yeah, it's huge. There's a huge basilica. There's the beautiful little house where she lived. I mean, it's not so little, but compared to the basilica, it is, and yeah, it is. I think those photographs have something to do with it. It's as simple as that. A lot of people you and I enjoy reading. We think about these things and we talk about these things. For some people, they just see her, and there's something about her in those eyes that say, this person knew what it was like to suffer, and yet this person was incredibly brave and incredibly graceful, and somehow is concerned with me, cares about me, manages to not be trapped within her own concerns, to actually pray for the church, pray for the faithful. They see love in her eyes, but not a kind of pop music love, a real love. And I think all of these things sort of come together in Therese, and it really is a perfect storm. When we spoke about her parents, and yeah, I think God raised up Therese, and he raised up her parents in order to sort of give her all that good stuff, all the devotions. Still today, we sometimes think we've got everything we need. Why are we struggling? The beauty of our faith, the beauty of the doctrine, the beauty of Scripture. Therese had all that set up, and yet even later on, when this book was to be published, when these photographs were to be presented to the world, she had 2 siblings, one of whom had brought a camera into the convent. That's how we've got those photographs. And she was a really accomplished artist. She was able to oversee that whole aspect of the cult after Therese's death. And Pauline was a really good editor and was able to present the text. There's providence all over Therese, and we should be ultimately very grateful for it. It's good to analyze why these things were, but we must always be grateful and devotional in our analysis, I think.
Yeah, I love what you're saying about her face, because you're absolutely right. There is something just so special about. I'm just thinking of the famous image, but I know though that this is just occurring to me that Therese herself had a devotion to the face of Jesus, didn't she? I mean, this face thing is very, very interesting.
Yeah, no, that is really interesting, because I've not sort of thought about. I mean, her devotion to the Holy Face was really important to her, and she, in fact, sought permission to add that to her religious name. So she was Therese of the Child Jesus and the Holy Face by the end of her life. And it is, the devotion to the Holy Face is such a beautiful devotion and such a miraculous and quirky French devotion as it had emerged.
Yeah.
But with that famous incident at St. Peter's, the miracle that had happened there, that sort of propelled it. But yes, to get back to what Therese says about the Holy Face, she sees in the face of Christ that real love, and she used to gaze at it every day. She had a mass card in her breviary. It was there with her in choir. She adored that face, and she ended up having a face that was a reflection of that face.
Yeah, very well said. In the time that remains, let's come back to her designation as a doctor of the Universal Church. There are only now with John Henry Newman becoming a doctor of the church, there are now 38, or there will soon be 38. But that is an extremely small number of figures to set aside in the whole history of the church as doctors. I wonder if you could say just a little bit more about what was it about her that John Paul II, who he himself may one day be a doctor of the church because of his just, giant intellect, giant love, his incredible significance as a philosopher and theologian and thinker. What was it about Therese, who had such a small output, I suppose we could say literarily, but whose work was so significant? Why did he really feel moved to give her that designation?
I think that there's a very smart Catholic, Irish Catholic, who I met on my sort of journey over the last few years, who said to me that what Pope St. John Paul II was trying to do was develop existential Catholicism, that Catholicism from the inside out, where the exterior is not lost, the devotions, the liturgies, the prayers, but where it is there, it's experienced. And of course, that much of his philosophy is very interested in phenomenology and psychology and in the personal aspect of faith. Newman gave him some of that as well. Therese was, I believe, just the essence of what that looked like, of that internalized Catholicism. She and although she wrote little, what she wrote really has that distillation of poetry about it. I mean, she wrote poetry as well, but it is every line. I mean, one of the conclusions that I came to in my little portrait of her was that it was because she meant it. When you realize that she meant every word she said, that's when it comes alive. Because you realize that every word is quite hard fought, and every word is precious, and so I think once if the penny drops for anyone like that on Therese, then she becomes a doctor because she lifts up and she heals and she corrects.
That's wonderful stuff, and I know all of our listeners and viewers will be eagerly anticipating your book when it appears, so we can uncover more of these insights that you have about Thérèse of Lisieux. In the meantime, our listeners and viewers can go to ignatius.com and find some resources that are already available, including Saint Thérèse of Lisieux, Living on Love, a book by Father Didier Marie Gollet. There's also a book called Saint Thérèse of Lisieux, Story of a Life by Guy Gaucher. And there's the film, a feature film called Miracle of Saint Thérèse. All of these are available at ignatius.com. And while you're there, pick up a copy of Father Tom Hiney's book, The Song of Ascents, Lives of Rage and Stillness. Father Tom Hiney, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
No, thank you very much. And thank you for what you all do there. You really do produce great stuff, and we're very grateful for it over here in England. Thank you.
Thank you very much.